We are on our way to a hazardous weather double header. This is Way Over Our Heads, a podcast on climate and weather. With me is Kenny Blumenfeld. He's a climatologist. I'm Jim Dubois. We're here at the Town Hall Lanes in South Minneapolis. Kenny, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you, Jim? Bottoms up.
Absolutely. Cheers to Friday.
Yes,
Cheers to the weekend, and possibly a big storm looming
this
here.
Is actually, I got to say, meteorologically, it doesn't get any more exciting than this. I mean, you could tell me, if it's summertime and we've got a tornado outbreak that's, looming in the near horizon, and then followed by some other weather hazard, I would say, come on. One is usually all you get.
Right.
We got two of them. We got snow, possibly pretty significant snow, and then we got cold. And it might be cold like we haven't seen in a while. So it's going to be an interesting time ahead, Jim.
Well, in terms of the snow, we're talking about the event starting sometime on Sunday, correct?
So we are, let's be real specific here. We are talking about Sunday, January 27th, correct? And basically, since, hey, we've got a statewide audience, so western Minnesota, the snow begins probably early in the day, Sunday, and then starts streaming southeastward towards southern Minnesota by late afternoon sometime. So southern and central Minnesota, and you kind of have to imagine a line that kind of runs, if not along, maybe parallel to Highway I-94, Interstate 94. To the north of that line, there's going to be light snow, or in some cases, no snow. To the south, along and south of that line, there's going to be heavy snow. And so basically it looks like sometime between Sunday evening and Monday morning, the snow is going to reach peak intensity. Now, it's not a typical heavy snow event. It's unique in many ways. One, Jim, you're familiar with the term Alberta Clipper?
Yes.
Okay, so
should we define that? Let's define that.
Go ahead and tell the listeners what an Alberta Clipper is, Jim.
Well, it comes from Canada, but you may be able to tell it a little more specifically than I can.
Well, where do you think in Canada it comes from?
The province of Alberta?
Yeah, that's generally, yeah. What I've always found interesting about the Alberta Clipper, these arbitrary names always amuse me. So you've got the panhandle hooker,
right,
which I think of as that's a fail. You also have the Wyoming stud muffin. No, that's not actually one.
Okay, all right.
I made that one up.
Okay.
Panhandle hooker is a low pressure system that comes out of the panhandles of Oklahoma, Texas, and it hooks northeastward towards the upper Mississippi Valley. The Alberta Clipper, which has two names. One is, it originates in Alberta, and two, they move along at a pretty good speed, and back when they were originally named, the only other thing that moved along at that speed was the old Clipper ship.
I
think the name's interesting because you know where Alberta is, right?
Right, yes.
It's landlocked.
It's right, landlocked.
They're not known for their massive shipyards.
Right.
So it's it's sort of like, it's an Iowa ocean liner. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But in any case, it's a low pressure system. Swirling, counterclockwise, swirling weather system that generally produces inclement weather. Now, these dive southeastward, and they tend to be associated, they're wintertime events for the most part. They tend to be associated with less moisture than those panhandle hookers, because you think about where the Alberta Clipper originates and where it goes, there's no great moisture source to be tapped into.
Right.
So these tend to be colder and drier, and they produce light and fluffy snow. This one's a little bit different in that it's powerful. It has a very strong temperature gradient, and it has more moisture than normal. So this thing is going to exploit both the cold conditions and the unusual quantity of moisture, and it looks like it's going to produce 6 to 12 inches of snow wherever it snows the most. Now, we're 2 days ahead of this storm right now, so if I had to guess, I would say from somewhere near the southern part of the Twin Cities, down towards the Iowa border and along the Minnesota River in southwest Minnesota. That's kind of where I'm thinking the heaviest snow will be. That's where you'll get that 6 to 12 inch jackpot. But, if the storm wiggles a little bit, that could be 50 miles farther north or south. So we're looking at snow, we're looking at wind, and because the temperatures are going to be probably in the single digits for most of the areas that receive the snow, it's going to be a very powdery snow. So it doesn't take much, maybe a 20-mile-an-hour wind, and that snow's going to get whipped around. You're going to have reduced visibilities, and this is all going to kind of start winding down Monday morning. But the Monday commute, if I had to guess, it's going to be a total mess in the Twin Cities, and really any area that gets any traffic at all throughout Minnesota. That's again kind of along and southwest of Interstate 94. It's going to be a tough spot.
So we are likely to see winter storm warnings, blizzard warnings out of this?
Well, I can't get in the heads of the forecasters.
True, yes.
But it looks like a shoo-in for winter storm warnings.
Okay.
The blizzard warning, the blizzard criteria are actually pretty stringent. You need to have quarter-mile visibility or less for 3 hours and winds sustained in the 30, 35 mile an hour range with higher gusts. I don't think we'll hit that, but because of the light powdery nature of the snow, this system might produce quite a lot of reduced visibility, and we might be looking at blizzard-like conditions, and the Weather Service at its discretion may have to issue some blizzard warnings to cover the stronger winds and the lower visibilities, especially in rural areas. But it's going to be a mess. Someone's going to end up with 8, 10, 12 inches of snow, and there's going to be a lot of blowing and drifting. We're going to have huge snow drifts out in rural parts of the state after this thing passes. It's going to be a winter wonderland.
Wow.
And that's hazard number 1.
Yes.
You heard about hazard number 2. Jim, what do you know about hazard number 2?
Okay, now is this going to relate to cold weather? Yes.
It does indeed relate to cold.
All right, so are we looking at some potentially record-breaking cold temperatures here, or maybe not?
I'm not going to pull the trigger on that one, because
Okay.
when we talk about records, those are hard to beat. I mean, we've got long records in Minnesota, and so when you've got 120, 140 years of history, it's hard to break a record in any season. And it's, we've discussed, it's especially hard to break those low temperature records in the wintertime.
Right.
But this is a very talented looking storm system. The caveat that I'll throw out there is all we have to go on are what the weather models tell us. We don't,
Right.
This whole myth of, oh, well, my grandpa didn't need weather models. My grandpa could just, stick his face into the wind and tell you the weather for the next 8 days. We've heard people say that, right?
Yes, or feel it in their bones.
Yeah, bones.
Right,
I mean,
right.
you can feel it in your bones, and you do know when a weather change is coming.
True.
And yes, tribal societies, people who work outside, do have an understanding of the weather that's more intuitive, even than many meteorologists.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But all that said, you can't know with precision based on your bones what's really going to happen, and you need weather models if you really want to get a sense with precision. Now, so the weather models that guide the forecasters have been very extreme with the cold air. The caveat is that as we're talking, Jim, we're in the midst of what looked 6 days ago like a pretty significant cold air outbreak, and we thought, based on the models, that the temperatures would be deep into the teens below zero in southern Minnesota, and in the Twin Cities, maybe even the 20s below zero, and then much colder up north. And that didn't materialize to that extent. We shaved about 10 degrees off of that cold. So we ended up closer to 10 below in the Twin Cities in southern Minnesota, and maybe in the 20s and 30s below up north. So still a good cold outbreak, but the models have some error and some what we call bias. In other words, they tend to overproduce cold air. So what we don't know is how much of the cold air that we're seeing in the models for this next outbreak is overproduced versus how much of it is real.
Right.
How much of it is going to become a physical reality, because these forecasts are pretty dire. If I had to guess, I would say in the Twin Cities, southern Minnesota, temperatures will easily get into the deep negative teens and negative 20s at the coldest time between Tuesday and Friday. And wind chills will easily get into the negative 40s because we're going to maintain reasonably strong winds. That is no joke. That would put us into wind chill warning criteria. And I'll just say it, Jim, if we get snow on Monday and we get the depth of cold remotely like what's being forecast, you're going to be looking at schools that miss 3 days next week.
Wow.
And that is almost unheard of.
That is.
So, yeah, I know. Did I just say that there are going to be areas that miss 3 days of school next week?
Kids are cheering you at this moment,
Oh my gosh,
Kenny.
I can't believe. Okay, I got to stick with it. I think there will be schools in Minnesota that miss 3 days next week.
Well, and there is a precedent for this because then Governor Arne Carlson, back in 1994, January, encountered some extraordinarily low temperatures combined with low wind chills, and by gubernatorial proclamation shut down every school in Minnesota.
For
we
how
might be
long?
looking at that. Well, I think that was pretty much for 1 day, but I mean, he recognized it as a true danger to students who might be out, waiting for buses and.
Yeah, I can't quite get in the heads of forecasters and administrators, but I can tell you from conversations we had today, this has everyone's attention. I would imagine 3 days next week. I would say Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, probably going to be school cancellations. First because of snow, and then Wednesday and Thursday because of cold. I don't know about statewide, but certainly in many, many areas. Someone commented to me today, and I thought this was hilarious. How come, if the temperature looks like it's going to go down to -20 in southern Minnesota, the whole state shuts down, but northern Minnesota routinely gets -30s and -40 and stays open?
Right. That is awfully interesting.
Yeah.
Are those folks just more acclimated to it?
It's a different composition of blood.
Yeah,
I don't know. I can't tell
so
you.
You're saying the Rangers have a hardiness that we may lack here in southern Minnesota, central and southern Minnesota?
My good friends up on the range, that is definitely true. They've experienced cold. They've experienced conditions that you and I maybe never have experienced.
Right.
Dozens and dozens of times. It's routine. A 35 below reading on the Iron Range is routine. And when the last time the Twin Cities did that? 19th century.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, so something that's customary for them is almost unheard of for us.
Wow.
But okay, so if we kind of think of most likely, the most likely case is temperatures in the -20s. Southern Minnesota, -40s in northern Minnesota, and we have wind chills in the -40s in southern Minnesota, and I'm going to say it, into the low -60s in parts of northern Minnesota. This is the most likely scenario. The worst case scenario would be that sometime on Wednesday and Thursday, temperatures approach the high -20s in southern Minnesota, maybe even getting into the -30s in parts of the Twin Cities in southern Minnesota. Again, we've only done that once, -30 or colder, once in the last 40 years in the Twin Cities. It's a little more common in areas just outside of the Twin Cities that are more rural, where it cools down more easily. But getting into the mid-30s, like some of the models suggest, is not all that common, even in the rural areas of southern Minnesota. And following in that same worst case scenario, you get temperatures possibly touching -50 in northern Minnesota. And the reason that would be interesting is we haven't had a -50 in the state since 2005. Now, the one thing going against that, making it a bit less likely, is the wind. Usually, do you remember February 2nd, 1996, when we broke the statewide record?
Okay, that was the last time it got extraordinarily cold in the state.
32 below in the Twin Cities and 60 below set the statewide record in Tower, Minnesota.
That's the air temperature, not the wind chill.
That's the air temperature.
Yes.
There was no wind chill temperature difference that day because in order to get that cold, you need the air to settle. It needs to be nice and calm, so that the coldest air can sink towards the earth. When you have wind mixing the air up, the coldest air remains suspended and it all mixed together. And so you might get really low wind chills, but it's hard to reach those record low territory. So one of the things we're looking at is that even though it's a deeply cold air mass coming in, and even though the models are very they're on board with a nearly record low scenario. We see a lot of wind. There's a strong pressure gradient, and even if the winds are 7 or 8 miles an hour, that would be enough to prevent us from getting to record low, all-time record low and record low temperatures. So again, the worst case scenario to me looks like you have temperatures approaching 50 below in northern Minnesota, but wind chills, I can't even believe I'm saying 70 below, possibly in some parts of the state. And again, maybe even in the 50s below zero near the Twin Cities for wind chills. That would be unreal. So
wow.
This is what we're looking at, Jim. We got phase 1, very likely snowstorm. If it doesn't nail the Twin Cities, it's going to affect southern Minnesota almost for certain, with a maximum swath of 8 to 12 inches and probably a lot of blowing and drifting and major snow drifts. Then you wait about a day as that system departs, the winds turn around from the north, and by Tuesday night we have bitterly cold air moving in, ushering in some of the lowest wind chills we've seen this decade. So it's a doubleheader.
Absolutely. So you're saying the morning commute in the Twin Cities on Monday is probably going to be a bear,
out to
correct?
Lunch. Yeah, out to lunch. It's going to be ridiculous, and people are going to not enjoy it. And then, you get a little buffer period on Monday where the temperatures remain mild, around the single digits above zero. And then, boom, it's a crash. And it's going to be quite a crash. Even, even that sort of most likely scenario that's not quite as dire, you've got temperatures falling towards 20 below in the Twin Cities and much colder than that in northern Minnesota.
Well, you mentioned how the wind almost somewhat counterintuitively might help, I guess, moderate the low temperatures.
The air temperature.
The air temperatures,
sure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this. Last week we talked about the albedo, the Earth's reflectivity.
Yeah.
So if we get a really good snowfall, that's going to probably drive temperatures lower than they would have been without the snow, correct?
That is correct. And that is now, the only part of the state of Minnesota that doesn't have a good reflective snow cover is the Twin Cities. That is all but guaranteed to change within a few days. So by the time we get to Monday evening, the whole state will be covered in a pretty clean white blanket of relatively fresh snow. Mind you, one that's blowing like crazy around most places. So if and when the sun comes out, it's not going to do anything, and you're just going to start shedding heat right off of that snowpack.
Right. So January has been a pretty strange month. We started out extremely warm with almost record high temperatures, and we're going to close out.
We're going to close out cold.
Very cold. And
some of the coldest we've seen in a long time. And then what's interesting is you kind of have a coin toss after that. We get into early February, and there's a lot of indication that the cold air mass moves off to the north and is poised somewhere just north of the Canadian border. So if you get heads, we go warm again and mild, and it's almost like this never happened. Although I think the cold is going to leave people with a lasting memory.
Yeah, this will be memorable, I think.
We've talked about what it takes to be remembered if you're a weather event, and I think this one's got the right stuff. But it's not going to be particularly, again, if we flip heads, it's not very long lasting.
Okay.
If we flip tails, because again, it looks like the cold boundaries somewhere around the Minnesota-Canada border, give or take a few hundred miles. If you flip tails, we might end up cold for the first 2 weeks of February too.
Wow.
I don't think we're going to see anything as intense in terms of cold as what's coming Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It's just hard to replicate that. But the way these cold outbreaks tend to work when they do get prolonged is, even if they're not as severe as the initial blast, you remain, below zero at night for a prolonged period. And either way, we're closing out January on a cold, cold note.
Well, you talked about the term Alberta Clipper. We also hear a lot about the polar vortex, which was a huge deal
talk about that.
a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Where are we with that now? Is this indicative of a polar vortex?
So there's some good things and some less good things that happened. In 2014, the polar vortex got branded. It's been a scientific fact that meteorologists and atmospheric scientists have known about for years. There's a basically a pool of air that streams around the North Polar region. It is a vortex by definition. It actually has a relationship. Part of its definition has to do with what's going on well above the ground, not at the surface where we live. But in any case, when the jet stream that keeps it locked up isn't particularly vital or healthy, and it weakens, then these lobes of this vortex can break off from that's their focal point over the North Pole, and they can actually drift farther south. And so in the case of 2014, we saw this broken piece of that polar vortex drift over the upper Midwest region and actually brought cold air right through the whole country. In this case, this is very similar. What we're dealing with is a disjointed, broken piece of that polar vortex. Looks like it's going to drift, if not over Minnesota, then certainly over the Great Lakes area, and bring the sort of the coldest part of that air mass very, very close to us. So what it means is, in the middle of the week, it's going to probably be colder, denser air in parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas than you would find 800, 1,000, maybe even 1,500 miles off to the north. Will be some of the coldest air in the continent will be centered over our region. That's a great distinction.
Absolutely, yeah. No kidding, wow.
Yeah, so this would, the problem with that term polar vortex is that it's been used every time it gets cold, and that's not really appropriate. The other thing that's not appropriate is, we've had these before. A lot of our really significant cold air outbreaks had the same mechanism behind them. It's just that in 2014, that term made its way into the public lexicon.
Right.
And so everyone's a little smarter and a little dumber for it. But, hey, any awareness about the weather is a good thing for me. So.
Well, one thing we made very clear about this podcast is it's our policy that climate change is a non-negotiable fact. It is scientific fact. It is what it is, and it's not debatable. But we are going to hear from people, no doubt, the climate change skeptics who will say, what global warming? Hey, it's really cold again. How do you address that?
It's actually a good question, because one of the things we've been saying, and I've been saying for sure, is that we don't get as cold as we used to. We can't. We're almost physically prevented from it by the additional greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If this coming outbreak proves that statement to be inaccurate, and we actually hit nearly all-time record lows, then I'm gonna have to throw some of that sentiment a bone and say, well, okay, maybe it's more about frequency than about the potential magnitude of the cold.
Right.
Because if we really are experiencing the kind of warming we've been talking about, we shouldn't be breaking record lows, and we shouldn't be breaking all-time record lows, and that would actually be, a somewhat legitimate curiosity that someone might have. I don't think that would alter the facts, which is that winter has been warming, irrespective of what happens this week, and that the frequency of cold days and the magnitude of cold days in general have been going down, been decreasing, irrespective of what happens this week. But I think the real interesting thing to watch is how cold don't we get?
Yes.
Let's not look at the statewide record of 60 below. Let's see, based on the goods, based on the ingredients, how well does this perform? Do we actually hit 30 below in the Twin Cities? Do we come even close? Do we hit 60 below? Or do we come even close? Do we even crack 50 below in northern Minnesota? If we don't get some of those basic cold weather benchmarks, that's actually a really strong argument that, given the extraordinary talent of this air mass, if we can't challenge those records, it really shows you where we are.
Right.
So that was kind of a turning it on its head that I did after the 2014 polar vortex, because the coldest day of that outbreak in the Twin Cities was like the 173rd coldest day on record.
Right.
Who cares?
Exactly, yes.
Hopefully It looks like this one has equal opportunity to perform maybe a little bit better, but we'll see. It's going to be interesting. And tell you what, Jim, if we do get as cold as it looks like we're going to get, then we can spend the next episode talking a little bit about what that means for our climate change messaging.
Excellent. Well, that's great. We'll plan on that. And also, Kenny, I do have to say, you were spot on when you mentioned there would be a window of a cloud-free sky for the super blood wolf moon total lunar eclipse this past Sunday.
Yeah.
It was phenomenal.
Yeah, you got your super duper moon.
Oh, it was memorable. And many people I spoke with, did you go outside and see it?
I saw the stars. I did not actually see much of the moon.
Okay, we watched kind of the entire event unfold, and it was amazing.
You know, I used to be better than an embarrassingly bad astronomer. When I was younger, I was pretty good, but yeah, I didn't do any observing.
Well, it'll be 18 years before we see it again. So luckily, we were not deprived of that opportunity.
But you know what's wonderful about all of this is astronomy keeps giving us gifts, and there will be some other celestial anomaly soon enough.
Right. Excellent. Well, Kenny, this was wonderful as always. This is Way Over Our Heads, a podcast on weather and climate. Kenny Blumenfeld is a climatologist. I'm Jim Dubois, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, we'll see you on the other side, Jim.
Absolutely, Kenny. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Stay warm.